One of the things that happens at the center is we're privileged to have some people as postdocs and associates and adjuncts and all the rest of it. And Christian has long been associated with the work of the center, and it's been a great delight and a privilege to have him around. He is an author of considerable note, having written Lockdown America, The Soft Cage, The Freedom, and now, of course, Tropic of Chaos. I was trying to think about how else to introduce him, and I happened to be in the elevator in my building, and the woman got in, and the opposite got in and said, "What's that book you're reading?" So I showed it to her, and she said, "Who's this guy?" And I tried to describe him, and she said, "Oh, he's a pundit." And I wasn't sure whether this is meant as a compliment or as a criticism. So I said, "Is that a compliment or a criticism?" She said, "Oh no, it's a compliment. It's really good to have pundits around." So if you want to put something on your CV, it's a pundit who's good to have around. Okay.
Okay, good.
But anyway, so it's really terrific to have Christian here. It's a fantastic book that he's produced, and it raises lots of questions and lots of interesting ideas, and I hope that we can have a discussion and debate. And I think the format will be that Christian's going to talk for some 10-15 minutes, something like that, about the book and some of the ideas which come out of the book and which are not necessarily even handled in the book. And then we'll get into a little bit of dialogue, and then we will open it up for you to have a discussion with him. So, Christian, if you like to take it away.
So thank you all for coming out, and sorry about the confusion. And also, Vijay Prashad was unable to make it because Metro North has been closed due to the storm, and he lives in Northampton. So we're missing his presence. And thanks to David and the center, I was actually, I came to the center as a postdoc, and it was the fulfillment of my original hopes as an academic in my education to finally study with David Harvey. So this book and all the other work really owes a lot to David's work. The idea of the book, the thesis of the book, is that climate change doesn't just look like bad weather. It also looks like religious warfare, banditry, counterinsurgency, border militarization, and that the connection between, the causal connection between climate change and various forms of violence may be attenuated, but it is very real and can be fleshed out. A couple days ago, there was a report released from Colombia that showed a correlation between El Nino events and violence. And the report didn't really explain what that, the paper guessed at what some of the causes could be. But of course, what the connections between violence and climate change run through all of the human institutions that are essentially what you would call imperialism, or more specifically, capitalism operating on a global scale. More specifically, what's happening now throughout the Global South is what I call the catastrophic convergence, which is a convergence of two pre-existing crises with the onset of anthropogenic climate change. And those pre-existing crises are the legacy of Cold War militarism, which has seeded much of the Global South with cheap weaponry and bands of armed men trained in asymmetrical warfare, be it as guerrillas or as mercenaries or as counterinsurgents. So they're trained in torture, smuggling, interrogation, assassination, small unit combat. And counterinsurgency, which was a crucial part of the Cold War's hot proxy wars, is particularly damaging to societies because it takes as its object the civilian society and not, as in conventional warfare, an opposing army. So the methods of counterinsurgency necessarily attack the social solidarity that I was mentioning in our warm-up there. And so societies are not only littered with cheap weaponry and men trained in the arts of assassination and killing and smuggling, but also very often traumatized in a specific way that primes them for further violence. People are uprooted from their homelands. They forget or are forced to forget their original languages. They move to cities. They are forced to turn against their countrymen and even fellow townsmen. An example of this, of course, probably the quintessential example of this is Guatemala, where, as is always the case in counterinsurgency, one of the army's methods, along with burning villages and relocating people into strategic hamlets where they could be observed, was the establishment of civil patrols or civilian auxiliaries, which had the effect of forcing people to, in some cases, kill and torture and interrogate their own community members. So the effects of that, beyond just the human rights abuses, are intense, and they leave societies very battered. So you see in Central America, for example, murder rates in some countries that are as high as were the death tolls during the civil wars of the 1980s. But there's no longer any cause. There aren't two sides in the conflict. It's just the reverberations of Cold War militarism. The other pre-existing crisis into which climate change now comes is the crisis of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has also ripped these societies of the Global South to pieces in many cases. The long story short is that the capitalist economies of the world are developing after World War II, in large part on the basis of the incredible destruction of wealth that was part of World War II. So the golden era of capitalism internationally was based on the recovery from World War II. Once that is sort of achieved, in many ways, economic stagnation sets in, falling rates of profit, and the whole social democratic compact and compromise that marked capitalist development during the Cold War also begins to fall apart. And David has written about this brilliantly in numerous books, most recently the Short History of Neoliberalism, and before that, Conditions of Postmodernity. But so the crisis of the Keynesian model, if you will, leads to an embrace globally of radical free market economics, the ideas that Hayek lays out in the 1930s and were pushing in from the right-wing fringe become, by the late 70s, early 80s, the policy in the West. And the knock-on effect of that in the Global South is that as Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the U.S., jacks interest rates in the late 70s, early 80s, with the intention of plunging the U.S. economy into a cold bath recession to help discipline labor unions here, all of the outstanding loans in the Global South, most of which were borrowed on variable interest rates, suddenly soar just as the world economy plunges into recession. That leads to the debt crisis. The debt crisis leads to the opportunity of the World Bank and IMF to impose structural adjustment on societies that have, by and large, been associated with increased poverty and increased inequality and a wholesale reduction of the presence of the state. And so into this crisis now comes climate change. And so, I mean, maybe the best way to illustrate this is how I open the book. I open the book with the death of a pastoralist, a Turkana pastoralist in northwest Kenya named Ekaru Lorman, who's been killed the day before, and he's lying there dead in the desert. And he asked, why has this guy been killed? At one level, he's been killed in a cattle raid. This neighboring tribe, the Pokots, came to steal his cattle, and he was killed along with 6 other people. But, the raid was driven by the fact that there's the worst drought in 60 years in the Horn of Africa, which is linked to climate change. It fits the pattern that climate scientists have explained will unfold. But so why is the response, the adaptation on the ground, to go and steal your neighbor's cattle with an AK-47? Partly because the state has withdrawn. All the old programs of veterinary services and well drilling and programs for water harvesting, all of that has been rolled up in the name of structural adjustment and market efficiency. So there aren't enough services for people, so they cluster around what few water holes there are. There's no browse left for the animals. It's drying up. So people are trying to replace their herds by stealing their neighbors. And why is this traditional activity of cattle raiding becoming so violent? Some of you no doubt read the news about this cattle raid right across the border from Kenya in Sudan, in which 600 people were killed last week. And in northwest Kenya, the conditions are similar. Hundreds of people a year die. The police are constantly patrolling, paramilitary police backed up by helicopters. The Ugandan army will cross the border into Kenya. The roads are unsafe to travel when there aren't cattle to raid. Cattle raiders will shoot up civilian buses. And every day in these communities, people are being killed and cattle are being stolen. And that wasn't the case in traditional raiding. The answer to that, in large part, is that weaponry is so cheap. And weaponry is so cheap because the Horn of Africa was one of the many hot front lines in the Cold War. And to reduce the story to just one kind of prime example, the collapse of Somalia means that that entire region is flooded with guns and lawlessness that now extends out into the Indian Ocean. Why did Somalia collapse? Somalia collapsed because, unfortunately, the socialist dictator Said Barre, there's a coup d'etat in 1969, and he declares himself a socialist, but is more than anything a Somali irredentist and nationalist, and he launches a covert war against Ethiopia right after there's been a socialist coup in Ethiopia. And he's trying to reclaim the Ogden region, which is a Somali-populated area of Ethiopia. Once he finds out that the Cubans who are supporting him are also have advisors and trainers in Ethiopia, Said Barre switches sides and in the Cold War, and the Carter administration gladly comes in to support Somalia with money from Saudi Arabia and arms from Pakistan. And what ensues from the late 70s until the early 90s is that both sides in the Cold War, in some cases, I would say, with the best of intentions, pour weaponry into this conflict, the end result of which is the collapse of Said Barre's military, and then with it the collapse of his state, and there hasn't been any kind of law and order in Somalia since. And so weaponry flows out to people like Ekuru Lorman and to the Pekot who killed him. So that's an example of the catastrophic convergence, how neoliberalism, the legacies of Cold War militarism, and the crisis of climate change all combine to express themselves as increased violence. It also, there's other examples in the book that I could get into, but you can find the same combination of forces in more urbanized settings. So just very quickly, Kyrgyzstan, last year, ethnic violence. The root cause was that Kyrgyzstan gets 90% of its electricity from hydroelectric power. There's been the worst drought in living memory over the last decade in Central Asia. The main hydroelectric dam was at the lowest level ever for water. The government had to start rationing power. As it rationed power, industry laid people off. The more people who are laid off, the less consumption there is, the more unemployment there is. Then the government decides it's going to re-engage a privatization program that had stalled, and it's going to privatize the utilities. So to make the assets more attractive, it doubles the tariff on power. At the same time, one of the worst winters on record hits Kyrgyzstan. Pipes are bursting, pensioners are freezing to death, cattle are freezing to death. They shut down all schools and government institutions for 2 months. The country just essentially shut down. They're coming out of that, and the president announces that he's going to double the tariff on power again. And so people hit the streets protesting the cost of living. And what starts out as a protest around class issues and the cost of living devolves into ethnic violence because there are these pools of lumpenized young Uzbek and Kyrgyz men who don't have jobs, they don't have education, they hang out in casinos drinking vodka, getting involved in the underworld, and that element turns these protests into violent pogroms. And so we then read in the paper, Uzbeks and Kyrgyz are at each other's throats, as they apparently do every couple decades. But really, underneath that economic crisis, underneath that ethnic violence is an economic crisis, beneath which is, but not reducible to, which is this climatologically driven crisis, the drought and the intense winter. So the rest of the book explores that dynamic in different ways in different places, and in the end, I try not to be a total buzzkill and rather cryptically return to the issue that David and I were talking about before, which is the state, the role of the state in coming up with a solution, both in terms of how we adapt to climate change and how we are to mitigate its effects, that is to say, cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the book in a nutshell. And yes.
I mean, this idea of a catastrophic convergence, it actually becomes more and more compelling as you go through the book. And for me, one of the things I love about this book is it's a fantastic work of geography, and I'm a geographer actually. So, and what Christian does is to get on the ground. And one minute you're in Kenya, then you're in Somalia, and then you're in Afghanistan, and then you're in Kyrgyzstan, and then you're in India, and then you're in, you know, Latin America, and so on. And I think that actually what comes out, methodologically in geography, we often have this problem of how do you pay attention to the particularities at the same time as you pay attention to the big picture. And I think this is a fantastic book that does that. That actually there's a lot of attention to these particularities. So you get a sense that there's something different that went on in Kenya than was going on in Somalia and Kyrgyzstan. But on the other hand, the patterning of there around this idea of a catastrophic convergence is really very, very strong. And I think this, you know, one of the things that gets a bit weighty after a bit is you turn to the next continent and you say, oh my God, I'm going to have another lot of that, and you do, actually. It's just kind of, so that's what's the distressing side of the book. But there are some actually questions I wanted to sort of get to. You start off the book towards the beginning with an account of how the Pentagon has got hold of this climate change stuff. And then starts to talk about, you know, how this is a major threat to US security and all the rest of it. Now, we know the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex usually lies through its teeth about things like, you know, I don't know, missile gaps and all the rest of it. And so one of the questions I think I had about that is, are they upping the story in some way? Are they making it appear even worse than it really is? And this I think relates a little bit to one of the questions which underlies the nature of the story you tell in the book. To what degree are you upping the story a little bit in the sense of going to all of the negative kinds of things without looking a little bit more at some of the positive sides of it? I mean, this struck me very much on the Latin American stuff. I mean, you do talk about the MST, you do talk in Bolivia about what went on around the water wars, and so you start to see, well, okay, there's something really positive going on here as well as the real downer stuff. So I wonder first if you could talk a little bit more about how you see the military apparatus using this as a reason to actually sort of, I don't know, get more resources and actually redefine its mission around more dirty wars, which is what it seems to be doing, and of course more technologies and you know, and then all of the privatized companies that are being part of that apparatus. Are they, you know, how are they approaching this?
Well, I don't think that, I mean, I definitely focus on the negative side of current world politics, but I don't think in overlooking some of the more positive stuff. I mean, the mission in this book is to sound an alarm, and the science is pretty clear, and it sounds crazy to say in such nice settings on such a nice day, even though we did have a hurricane. But the science is pretty clear that we are headed in a very bad direction. And that's what the Pentagon refers to again and again. They rely on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's main clearinghouse for vetting climate science. It doesn't, the IPCC doesn't produce science itself, it vets science and tries to make it available to policymakers in a way that they can use to adapt and mitigate the climate crisis. And if anything, the IPCC is very conservative in its findings and in its assessments reports every 4 years. And I mean, the reason I don't think the military is particularly playing it up is because it's actually not that big a part of their discourse. I mean, maybe I'm playing up the extent to which they focus on it. It's a small sector of the kind of planning elite within the military. Think about this. It's been introduced into the Quadrennial Defense Review of the US, which is the strategic document that comes out every 4 years. But when the military are expanding their special forces operations into Yemen and places like that, they don't refer to climate change as not part of the discourse. It's only at the kind of elite parts of the sort of intellectual elements of the Pentagon that this is an issue. But in a way, that doesn't really matter. And I don't think that I don't think that it's just searching for enemies and profiteering that is driving this. I think that the world is in a profound crisis that can be very hard to see in New York City, but that the victory of capitalism over the left domestically around the world again and again, and internationally, not that the left internationally embodied in the Soviet Union didn't have problems, as I was explaining around Somalia, but that there is there's a whole new set of crises that are unfolding that are very real, and that the Pentagon is actually just responding to that in a way that ultimately will make the problem worse, but that it's quite genuine. They see a planet in profound crisis, and they are trying to come up with a way to essentially manage its decline militarily.
Yeah, I sometimes think when they get into that, they create a mess and then they say it's due to something else.
Yeah.
So in a way, I mean, your story is that they created a lot of this awful mess out there, and now they're kind of saying, well, climate change, and so that in a way that there's a self-perpetuating side to that military apparatus, which comes through, I think, really strongly when you get into the historical dimensions of this, which is the other side of the book. I think it's very good that you're very good at looking at some of the historical roots of all of this, taking back, burning villages, going back to British colonial practices and all the rest of it. So I think there's that side of it. But let me ask you something else. I mean, one of the other concepts I actually had a bit of a problem with was this idea that of failed states. You sort of say, well, the problem in Kenya or in Somalia in particular is you've got a failed state. And I always want to ask the question, well, failure for whom? Who is it failing? And it turns out, of course, for some people, those so-called failed states are great. I mean, they're having a great time, selling guns to them and doing all those kinds of things. So I wonder if rather than sort of dividing the world into states that work, and you quote somebody who kind of says, well, okay, there's the states that work and then there's failed states. Rather than sort of dividing it that way, you might want to have a bit more nuanced kind of view as to what kinds of states there are there. I mean, I look at this country, and frankly, I've looked at the last few months, and I thought, we have a failed state here, so why the hell, and there's a sense in which maybe that's too sharp a dichotomy.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I would say calling this country a failed state is too sharp, is a misuse of the term, but it is a right-wing term, and I used it partly to be provocative, because I think that there is a sort of disregard for the real crisis of violence in the global south, which I saw as a reporter. And I think that there's legitimacy to the term of a failed state because it's only very, very small minority capitalist interests that benefit out of failed states. Yes, they can get coltan out of East Congo. They can get cocoa cheaper out of Cote d'Ivoire when there's crisis there. But it's a failed state in the terms that the mainstream means it, in that there's no law and order. And I think it also does fail even in the totally amoral terms of global capitalism. I don't think global capitalism benefits from having a new piracy problem. They've come up with ways of dealing with it. They ransom their way out of the situation in Somalia. But I think it's maybe not a crisis, but it's definitely a problem. And there are some parasitic interests that learn to operate in war zones and failed states. But ultimately, I think that there is enough of the political class internationally who would prefer to have a world divided between rich and poor and people in misery, where you have access to their resources without having to pay any fees and taxes, but would also like to not have their ships hijacked, and would also like to not have to pile on security costs to do basic business in these regions. And there are, in fact, places that are off limits to capital. I mean, the land grabs that are going on in Africa, you can't do that in Somalia. And if that spreads, a lot of these deals that the Pakistanis, Chinese, all, Harvard's, investment fund have secured are going to be worthless if there's no basic law and order in places. And so I guess maybe that's kind of a right-wing position, but I have having been in failed states, I appreciate some rule of law.
One other aspect I'd like to get to is, we were talking earlier a little bit about the whole kind of question of the metabolic relation to nature. And of course, climate is just one aspect of that. I mean, we have land degradation, we have, so, when you're looking at the environmental issue, would you want to make it much broader than just climate change, or is that just one element of a whole package? How do you see that?
And then maybe after, then I'll ask you the question.
No.
But because the plan was I was going to ask him a few questions as well. So, I end trying to come up with something hopeful. I end with a discussion of Marx and Engels' idea of the metabolic rift, that capitalism is incompatible with nature, that nature has limits and capitalism potentially can grow forever, and argue that it's possible to bracket out climate change from the larger set of overlapping environmental crises, because it can seem that climate change is all of the problems together because it is potentially the most catastrophic, but actually it's possibly just a subset. And the reason I do that is because the time frame, if we are to believe the science, and there is a rather amazing scientific consensus around the seriousness of this problem, and if we're to believe that, we do not have another 100 years to work out this problem. We have to start dealing with it now, like immediately, in the next few decades. And that means that capitalism and these institutions have to solve the climate crisis. Is it at all conceivable that capitalism could solve all of these environmental crises, overfishing, soil degradation, pollution of toxic chemicals in the environment? No, that's unrealistic. And that's just to think that capitalism in the next 3 decades has to reconcile itself with nature is impossible. Is it possible that capitalism can shift from burning coal and oil to generating energy in a way that does not load the atmosphere with CO2, and that thereby we can avoid tipping points, to merely buy ourselves time to deal with all the other environmental crises? I hope it's possible, and that's what I try to do, is break out climate change as a subset of the metabolic rift. And I leave unexamined on the question of what are the real limits to capitalism. I address only the climatological problem. And, as I was writing the book, I was wondering, what would David think about that? I mean, what really are, when you're not, when one is not just making an argument to make a point about how powerful Marxism is in analyzing the situation, but when we're thinking politically, here and now, realistically, about what the possibilities are, what do we think about? How do we think about the limits of capital, the limits of nature, and the potentially apocalyptic scale of capitalism?
Well, capitalism has a tendency, this is again Marx talking in terms of tendencies, to degrade the two major sources of all wealth, i.e. the labourer and the soil. But it's competitive capitalism that does that. And so one of the questions which has arisen historically is, are there ways to modify or underpin, if you like, put a base under capitalist competition so that competition does not drive you into a sort of après-moi le déluge kind of politics in which you just simply go for it and go for it and go for it. And actually this is a thesis that comes out very strongly in Marx's chapter on the working day, when he kind of says individual capitalists maximizing their own interests in competition with each other will force labourers to work under, more and more degraded conditions until essentially they kill off all the labourers. So the answer is that even the capitalists themselves at some point or other will recognize that they need some sort of regulatory basis that says there's a limit below which you cannot go. And even capitalist class interests can support the shortening of the working day, or limits on the length of the working day. That is, that you have to do something of that sort. And we've seen the same thing happening in the area of environmental regulation. The attempt is to put some base under capital, and then the question is, who puts the base? Do the capitalists agree to it, or are they forced by external forces? In the case of the working day, it's working class that does it for them, and in effect protects them from their own stupidity by getting well organized and all the rest of it. And then, of course, we have various other movements that are about protection of nature. So the history of capitalism has been, if you like, mitigated, the tendency has been mitigated a little bit by these counter forces. But one of the things we've seen, I mean, what is it the Republican Party wants to defund right now? They want to get rid of the EPA, right? They want to get rid of all environmental regulation. They want to get rid of all of that, you know. And this is the sort of crazy Koch brothers and that, and they're into the après-moi le déluge kind of politics. And the interesting question is, and I wrote a little piece about this recently where I kind of asked the question, you know, Marx always thought a rebellious working class would destroy capitalism, but maybe the Koch brothers and the Republicans will do a better job. Precisely because, you know, with climate change and all the rest of it, they'll, you know. So I think there is an interesting political question, which then gets back to that other issue that lurks here, is what is the role of the state? And in this instance, it would have to be also a state system, a global state system when it comes to climate change. What would its role be in dealing with, somehow or other, this question of climate change? And what we've seen in things like the Kyoto Protocol is that it's not worked very well. The one where it did seem to work reasonably well was the Montreal Protocol, which curb CFC emissions, and there are some other examples. I mean, for instance, DDT regulation was one where, to some degree, a configuration of states agreed on this. But with climate change, we haven't got to that point yet. And there's an interesting kind of question, and which actually takes me back to the question of the military. If the military are really so convinced about the problem of climate change, why don't they go off and tell Perry to get off saying it doesn't exist, you know, and say, look, we're going to get all our money out of dealing with this, so come on, get off that bandwagon. So I think there's there's an interesting kind of set of political questions there about what kind of regulatory apparatus will work, and this is one of the problems that I have with a lot of the contemporary left, is the contemporary left doesn't want to have anything to do necessarily with the state apparatus. It doesn't want to have anything to do necessarily with international agreements. It sort of takes the view that somehow or other this can be solved by local initiatives and by working in civil society. And I'm not against doing that at all. I think that's a great idea. But it forms what I would call a sort of an anti-capitalist politics of a certain sort, which is what I call it's a termite politics. You sort of gnaw away at the basis of the whole of capitalism, and in the end it all falls down. And I think that's fine, actually, except that you've got to figure out that the capitalists are not stupid. When they start to see things falling down, they'll bring out the exterminators and then watch out. And so the termite politics doesn't work unless you can actually grab hold of state power and do something, which is why I was so excited about what's going on in Chile, that they're actually really going for the state and saying the state has to be radically reformed and radically reconfigured around a completely different agenda. And I think part of the problem right now around the world is that there is not enough pressure being put on individual states to force the kinds of agreements. I mean, Bolivia has really tried. Mm-hmm. They really tried, and I give them tremendous credit for that. But nobody else really wants to go down that path. And when you look at somewhere like China, you kind of say you're not really sure how it's going to work in a place like that. So I think the question of the regulation of our relation to nature cannot be decided by individual action. It has to be decided by a whole set of different scalar actions, activism at the base amongst individuals, activism at community level, local levels, regional levels. I think that reorganizing cities, for example, around a bioregional kind of concept, and dealing with this kind of crazy business of long commutes and all the rest of it, the waste, I mean, I think the most anti-ecological form of urbanization that's ever been invented is the American suburb. And something has to be done about suburbanization and anti-suburbanization politics. So there are many things of that kind, but those cannot be worked out without having actually different levels of decision making which are integrated with each other. And that seems to me to be one of the key things that comes out at the end of your book, that there's no solution to these macro kind of problems without having a very different kind of organizational structure as to how decisions are going to be made and how things are going to work.
You know, in terms of that, I've been thinking about this hurricane compared to Katrina. And I went to New Orleans, and I arrived 4 days after the hurricane. And as you all know, the narrative of that was the failure of the state. And it was very unfortunate in a way that a left-wing critique of the failure of the state unintentionally fed into this idea that's a hallmark and a talking point of the hard right, which is that the state is useless, it's no good. And I suspect that out of this hurricane, perhaps, because there's been a bit more planning, people might realize that in fact the state sometimes is absolutely essential and does do things well, and that in fact there are no individual solutions, that there's only collective solutions in the face of an emergency like a hurricane hitting New York, and it wasn't a hurricane when it arrived, but that potentially one part of climate change could be that as we face emergencies, people will be forced to realize, okay, wait, the government isn't just about plundering our taxes and handing it over to Halliburton. There are still elements of it that are about public service that operate, on the basis of use values rather than exchange values, and that we need to endorse and support those. And I think hopefully that will become more apparent as people realize that they have to rely on it. But we'll see. Now, another question I had for you about in Marxism, the working class is the class that is most theorized, and the ruling class becomes the capitalists, but doesn't really become a political entity. And it seems to me that the ruling class in many ways, and this is something I owe a lot of what I'm saying here to Doug Henwood, who I've discussed this with, and these are very much his ideas and part of a project he's working on about the ruling class. But it seems that the ruling class in many ways becomes politicized the same way the working class does, that it becomes a class for itself when it is threatened. And when that threat is removed, it's no longer coherent. It's no longer thinking coherently as a class. It's then thinking, as it is now, just as interest groups, sectional interests. I mean, we don't have a healthcare policy for capitalism. We have a healthcare policy for the healthcare industry and the insurance industry, and it doesn't really make sense for the automobile industry. And it seems to me that if you read history from the Kennedy era, I mean, they would talk explicitly about the system. What does it mean that we lost at the Bay of Pigs? What does it mean that the Russians got a dog into space for the system? And what do we do for the system? It seems like those discussions don't happen among the Western ruling classes because of their victories in a way. And I'm wondering if, hopefully, there's a new threat to force them to give a little, to keep a lot. But also, I'm wondering if you think that the crisis of nature may, in fact, force elements of the political elites to embrace planning again. Because it seems that in the past, that also was an element of external threat that forced elements of the capitalist class to embrace planning, embrace regulation, embrace some level of economic redistribution.
I don't think they see the threat in the way that you would want them to.
No.
I mean, I don't see them. Some of them do, and some of them don't. I mean, that's the problem. So there's no coherent class position about it. And again, it's factionalized. The energy companies, as you point out, spend all this money on climate change denial politics. And then another faction, which is into environmental technologies, is doing exactly the opposite, you know. So they're factionalized on this kind of question. I don't think they see it as a major question that they have to unite around and really address. That's my feeling about it. But that could change. But the other big, I think, problem is that as you show in your book, in each place you go to, there is a specific character to how this crisis is felt and understood. In other words, there's an immediate, what immediately hits you as what the nature of the problem is. You don't necessarily think about drought or anything like that. You think about it in some other terms. And in each place, it's something different. And so you don't see the underlying kind of problem. And the scientists can see it, some other people can see it, but a lot of people don't even experience it. Not even just the capitalist class, but people don't experience it as, if you like, that's the nature of the problem. So this is a particularly difficult kind of problem to address for that reason.
Mm-hmm. Should we open it up to questions?
Yeah, let's open it up now and have you. So yeah.
There was one point where Christine.
You should probably stand up and shout so everybody hears the
or
question.
at least shout.
It's a bit intimidating.
Yeah, that's all right.
There was a point, Christine, where you said you hope that capitalism manages to run on green energy to buy us time in order to sort out all those other problems. And I'm thinking of Tim Mitchell's kind of deconstructivist material history of the carbon complex, which says that political economy has been shaped by the sort of flavor of fossil fuel energy we use. So there was a way that capitalists had to control the miners, which is different from the way that they have to control the laborers involved in the extraction of oil. Is there actually a transitional capitalism that is green? I mean, is there a sort of, wind or solar flavored political economy of carbon democracy?
Well, there isn't one, no. But there's potentially a shift in the energy industry. I mean, the easy case to make is that the jig is up and that we have flown over the edge, the tipping points are coming, and this civilization is going to collapse. That by the time the effects of climate change kick in, the causes will have become so built up that it will be impossible to address. The obvious tipping point is that the melting of the permafrost and the release of methane in the Arctic. Methane is a greenhouse gas 20 times more powerful than CO2. Once the primary cause of greenhouse gas buildup in the environment is the natural release of methane, there's very little civilization can do. So it's easy to make the case that we have crossed the point of no return. What's more difficult and somewhat uncomfortable for me, at least, as a person of the left, is to try and come up with a realistic seeming scenario for how we avoid that. And it involves, I think, capitalism moving off of fossil fuels towards other forms of energy, wind, solar, and hydroelectric. It is totally unrealistic to think, I believe, that the entire global economy, which is primarily capitalist, could be transformed in the time necessary. Could the energy sector be meaningfully transformed? Possibly. That's a much different and smaller project. So that's what I'm talking about. And there is movement in that direction, but there's tremendous pushback from the fossil fuel industry, which has all of this sunk capital, which is threatened with being turned into scrap metal if there's a policy shift away from fossil fuels. The other thing that happens is this idea of a class in itself or a business faction in itself versus a business faction for itself. The green energy people are lackadaisical. They're not politicized. They're not like the fossil fuel industry. They're not born out of armed conflict with workers. They don't defend their interests. They just hope that their gadgets sell well.
Can I just add something to that? I mean, I want to emphasize this notion of time lags. And I think, again, the CFC thing is a very good example. The Montreal Protocol was passed, 1982 or 5 or something?
87, I think.
87, was it? Okay. 1987. CFCs are only just now beginning to go down.
Mhm.
So when you're looking at the climate change stuff, you're looking at time lags of 30 years, 40 years before you really start to clean out the stuff. So you've got to be really, and that's why this is such a dangerous situation. If people don't see, what the time horizon of a lot of business decisions right now is, next 6 months, and that's it. And that's where you get into this après-moi le déluge kind of stuff. But you've got to have a much longer time horizon, and the big question is, who's going to have that time horizon? And who is going to sit and say to everybody, no, you cannot do that, because on this other time horizon, this is what it looks like. And that's going to be a disaster. So this is again one of the issues. Yeah, yeah.
So you seem to talk about government as the only way to mitigate all these kinds of issues in being comprehensive and all that. But I was wondering if you could talk about the role of culture in helping or hindering policies. For example, just recently in the New York Times, they were talking about how community groups in England were going through the whole NIMBY effect of not wanting to build wind turbines in their own communities because they're ugly, they're low property value, they hurt animals. And so they're being built more inefficiently because they're further away, and et cetera, et cetera. So I guess, how do you see cultural barriers of community politics affecting how the state responds to climate chaos?
Well, there has to be a shift in cultural values in the West for the state to really engage in robust planning again. In China, political despotism does have its benefits. They don't have those problems. This is the efficient place to put the windmills. That's where they go. And I suspect that a lot of this NIMBYism is funded covertly by the fossil fuel industry. But in terms of the cultural shift, one thing about in terms of termite politics, the localista stuff, I agree that it's ultimately a lot of what is explicitly suggested by that politics of communities solving their own problems, being self-sufficient in the face of the collapse of civilization is totally unrealistic. But I think there's what Robert Merton, the old sociologist, would have called the latent and the manifest function of these movements. There's a group around the country, at least in Putney, Vermont, which is where I'm originally from, which has just been very badly flooded. There's Transition Putney, and there's groups that are about like reskilling and preparing for the post-oil world, which I don't really believe in peak oil. And you can see that the manifest function is the idea that they're planning for the apocalypse, and it'll be like a version of the 19th century with robust town meetings. But then the latent function is actually to build political and social solidarity that might be useful and for something completely different, like mobilizing around state policy and a much bigger set of solutions. So culture is essential, as your question points out, and it works in sometimes slippery ways.
Being in failed states and given the level of violence that you witnessed, you referred to the necessity of law and order. So much of the audience just sort of laughed and dismissed that as a right-wing term. But in parallel, David, when you spoke about sort of a solution to the ills of our time as a socialist state, which of course I find also very sympathetic given the violence of the state that we have now, the idea that we should make demands of attack in a more social fashion, of course, makes sense. But there was I'm concerned that there's no questioning of that, and I don't think that it will do to call serious critiques of the state and critiques of the left by the left to just dismiss it as a termite politics, given the history of state socialism in the 20th century. So I don't have a blueprint or a solution. I'm not a champion of what you sort of dismissing what we call the termite politics or of these localisms as a solution to grand world problems. But I do take critiques of the left, from the left, and anti-statist, anti-authoritarian critiques extremely seriously. I think we have to. And right, and also, sorry, in relation to that, the idea that Katrina showed once and for all should prove to the public that the state is actually good in some fashion.
That's not what I said.
Okay,
It was the opposite. That in that example, it was that the state fails.
Right.
Because it wasn't present. But then I was hoping maybe this time.
Point that it's not a coincidence that that the state, right, left people to die and poor people and black people to die. Of course, the dream is that a socialist state would not serve capitalists, but would serve the majority of the people or collective needs. And of course, this is a dream that we have to sort of push for and aspire to. And as David pointed out, that there's many sort of counter movements towards the excesses of capitalism to get basic demands and social welfare, etc., from this state that otherwise serves the elites to a degree. But I just would be wary a little bit without any other sort of blueprint, offering some sort of blueprint that we don't dismiss an anti-authoritarian, anti-state politics so easily, because
I don't think.
which is what I'm hearing.
I don't think that's what David meant.
I want to defend termites. I think they're fantastic animals.
Yeah.
And actually, I think it's a fantastic form of politics. I mean, it's great. I mean, it's not dismissive at all. But anyway.
Yeah. No, I mean, and nobody's advocating for a return of, the Soviet Union. That's not the model. It's what we're talking about. And what we're doing here is, beforehand we were talking about, how Tony Judd in his book Ill Fares the Land has this great line about how we have to rethink the state. And so that's what we're trying to do. It's not, I wouldn't worry about, a communist takeover and all that kind of, because it's just, the time frame doesn't allow. What we're talking about is trying to get the idea of government planning and regulation of capitalism to have some traction and legitimacy. I mean, I think that's like what is really doable and the real set of parameters of the discussion of how the left has to think about the state. And I don't think we were dismissing, anti-authoritarian left critiques. I don't. I take them seriously. But I also don't want to stop there. I also am aware of a kind of intense romanticism of the local, romanticism of the community, an unthinking dismissal of the state.
And the opposite as well. That's really my only intervention. And I'm not sure that wariness actually exists. Not of a communist takeover, obviously. I mean, that's just absurd and fantastic. But again, just sort of people's natural, instinctual response or towards this idea of law that we mobilize in an ethical way. But to see that lacking in the discussion of a socialist state, but that wariness I just didn't do that. But I think that's
Well, look, if you two, okay. The last couple of weeks I've been reading sort of a lot of Murray Bookchin. And Murray Bookchin is in favour of municipal libertarianism. Now, municipal organisation is, okay, it's not a state, is it? But on the other hand, when you start to say, what are the rules and regulations that exist within this municipal libertarianism, then he kind of says, well, you understand perfectly well, and this is one of the big critiques which is made, is that if you do not have means by which there are resources redistributed from one municipal libertarian entity to another, then that can be a recipe for enormous inequalities in the world. And the only way you can deal with that, he says, is where you start to have regional assemblies, which are, and then, and pretty soon you're into a sort of, dare I say it, hierarchical forms, but no, you're not supposed to talk about hierarchies anymore, everything has to be horizontal, and I like to be horizontal most of my life, but I actually like to stand up occasionally. So I kind of think, so I think there's a way in which the left is often talking about these things which is not helpful. And I agree with you entirely that the critique is there, and it's a very solid critique, but when you look at something like a Murray Bookchin sort of structure, I'm sorry to say, it looks to me like a set of territorial forms which look like a state, feel like a state, and walk like a state, except they do so with a different kind of standard of how the base relates to the various institutions which are set in motion there. And then if you look at something like saying, I mentioned the CFC, the Montreal Protocol, how is that negotiated and how is it set up? Well, this is a very progressive thing to have happened. And if you wanted it to happen, the only way it could happen was actually by having state apparatuses there that could reach those agreements. And particularly with the climate change thing, there's no way. You're going to have something that looks like a state that does something like that and then kind of starts to regulate and set up certain rules and the rest of it. So we've got ourselves into a discursive kind of corner where we can't talk about a whole bunches of things. The critique is there. I agree with you entirely about the critique, but we're not able to talk about some of the other forms of organization that can go to other levels of generality and start to deal with some of the major global problems that exist, which need organizations of some kind, where we cannot have a global assembly to decide certain things, because, you know, where you're going to put, you know, enough problems getting 6.8 billion people in here would be a rather hard push. So so those are the issues that concern me, that by having to think about the structure of institutional arrangements, that we have to revolutionize institutional arrangements, and it's very important that they get revolutionized in ways which take account the critique and the past failures, but also which recognize some of the past successes. And I would cite something like the Montreal Protocol as a past success. I mean, the ozone hole would be, you know, 15 times larger than it currently is, and we'd probably all be dying of skin cancer by now had that, you know, had that regulatory apparatus not been set up by international agreement. And so, you know, we've got to start to be able to think at that level at the same time as we do indeed engage I'm in favour of permanent termite politics. And I can tell you, termites are going to be here long after we've all disappeared. So I have a great faith in the future of termites. Let's go right at the back, sorry. Let's go right at the back.
I'm not talking about market mechanisms. I'm not adoring capitalism. I'm talking about this social system and what's going to happen in the next 30 years. I don't even think in terms that your question asked. I never entertain questions like, what kind of social system should there be in Somalia? It's a question that I find absurd. No offense. First of all, it would have to be generated by people there, and there are social systems there in failed states, and it's warlordism, and there's no progressive politics in a place where if you step out of line and you say something that the man with guns don't like and they can kill you and get away with it, there's nothing. There's no protest movement. There's no progressive politics in places like Cote d'Ivoire, in Afghanistan. The left is dead inside failed states. So maybe that's why I embrace that label, actually. That's why. It's because the left, I went to Afghanistan and it was looking for, actually the first article I ever did from Iraq, I went and I wanted to find out what's up with the left. They once had the largest communist party in the world, or in the Middle East, in Iraq, and searched around for the left and realized, wow, when a state collapses and the right can kill anyone they want with total impunity, there is no space for an unarmed left. And there was no armed left in Iraq. And I guess that would be fundamentally why, that was the moment when, and that is why I think that term failed state is legitimate. Sure, capitalist interests can work within there, but there's, from our point of view, as progressives, it fails our agenda in the most profound way. There's no room for politics. In terms of a little bit of law and order, I mean, I'm just trying to disabuse people of any romantic notions they have about what it's like to travel through a landscape, where instead of easy pass toll booths, there are, men with guns. It precludes all politics. And in terms of thinking about the state, rethinking the state, it has to happen at all these different levels. I'm personally not so attracted to the larger questions. I didn't mean to dismiss actually your suggestion. What are these larger structures? What should they be like? And that's what you're talking about. For me, when I think about rethinking the state, I think about rethinking the discourse in everyday politics among normal people in America about what the role of government is. What is this thing that they talk about constantly on television? They're constantly heaping calumny and hatred on the public sector in the state. And I think that is one of the first and most important places to intervene is in just like notions that circulate among regular people about what the public sector is, what the government is, what does it do. Corey Robin had a great article in, I think it was The Nation, where he argued, you know, that he was trying to reclaim freedom. That was sort of the whole gist of the piece. But actually, within it was actually, he was trying to rebrand the state as the institution that protects freedom, you know, protects people's liberty against the dictatorship of the market. And, you know, I think interventions like that are very important at a level of kind of everyday micropolitics, so that when we think about this hurricane, it's an opportunity to point things out. That, you know, it was not some fee-for-service, emergency service thing that helped anyone. It was the public sector. It was our tax money, you know, and it was forward-thinking planning by bureaucrats that got the subway cars out of the yards that flooded so that we can get to work tomorrow. And to just remind, that's the first step, to remind people that there already are socialistic elements in capitalism, that capitalism has always depended on the state. And that's a first step. That's not a solution. That doesn't deal with these questions, what should the state look like? That's about like just reinvigorating some legitimacy, connecting the commonwealth and the state, the common good, the common interest with the public sector.
And I'm sorry,
We're going to, excuse me, we're having to get out of here fairly soon, so what I think we're going to do is I'll just take one more question here, and then we'll have to wrap up. So, yes, you.
Some of us are working against the FTAs, and when you talk about order, you know, there's an investor-state litigation procedure tied to these trade agreements that mean that a corporation will supersede the state in power by, like in El Salvador, being able to, the Pacific Rim is suing the government of El Salvador for limiting their profit taking by protecting the environment against cyanide that will be used in gold extraction. Okay, so corporations are people, and corporations can sue a state. How do we counterpose the power of the state when the corporation seems to be the defining power to maintain order?
Well, I think if corporations are people, we should be able to put them in jail.
And execute them.
We
So,
thought of that, but it's, you know,
yeah, right.
accusing them of murder, theft.
Right. Yeah. Okay, we should leave it here, and there's a reception outside, so we should continue this
Yes.
informally outside. So thank you
Thanks
very
for
much.
coming. Seeded much of the global south with cheap weaponry and bands of armed men trained in asymmetrical warfare, be it as guerrillas or as mercenaries or as counterinsurgents. So they're trained in torture, smuggling, interrogation, assassination, small unit combat. And counterinsurgency, which was a crucial part of the Cold War's hot proxy wars, is particularly damaging to societies because it takes as its object the civilian society and not as in conventional warfare an opposing army. So the methods of counterinsurgency necessarily attack the social solidarity that I was mentioning in our warm-up there. And so societies are not only littered with cheap weaponry and men trained in the arts of assassination and killing and smuggling, but also very often traumatized in a specific way that primes them for further violence. People are uprooted from their homelands. They forget or are forced to forget their original languages. They move to cities. They are forced to turn against their countrymen and even fellow townsmen. An example of this, of course, probably the quintessential example of this is Guatemala.
It's really terrific to have Christian here. It's a fantastic book that he's produced, and it raises lots of questions and lots of interesting ideas, and I hope that we can have a discussion and debate. And I think the format will be that Christian's going to talk for some 10-15 minutes, something like that, about the book and some of the ideas which come out of the book and which are not necessarily even handled in the book. and then we'll get into a little bit of dialogue, and then we will open it up for you to have a discussion with him. So, Christian, if you like to take it away.
So thank you all for coming out, and sorry about the confusion, and also Vijay Prashad was unable to make it because Metro North has been closed due to the storm, and he lives in Northampton, so we're missing his presence. And thanks to David and the center. I was actually, I came to the center as a postdoc, and it was the fulfillment of my original hopes as an academic in my education to finally study with David Harvey. So this book and all the other work really owes a lot to David's work. The idea of the book, the thesis of the book, is where, as is always the case in counterinsurgency, one of the Army's methods, along with burning villages and relocating people into strategic hamlets where they could be observed, was the establishment of civil patrols, or civilian auxiliaries, which had the effect of forcing people to, in some cases, kill and torture and interrogate their own community members. So the effects of that, beyond just the human rights abuses, are intense, and they leave societies very battered. So you see in Central America, for example, murder rates in some countries that are as high as were the death tolls during the civil wars of the 1980s. But there's no longer any cause. There aren't two sides in the conflict. It's just the reverberations of Cold War militarism. The other pre-existing crisis into which climate change now comes is the crisis of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has also ripped these societies of the Global South to pieces in many cases. The long story short is that the capitalist economies of the world are developing after World War II, in large part on the basis of
things that happens at the center is we're privileged to have some people as postdocs and associates and adjuncts and all the rest of it, and Christian has long been associated with the work of the center, and it's been a great delight and a privilege to have him around. He is an author of considerable note, having written Lockdown America, The Soft Cage, The Freedom, and now, of course, Tropic of Chaos. I was trying to think about how else to introduce him, and I happened to be in the elevator in my building, and the woman got in, and the opposite got in and said, "What's that book you're reading?" So I showed it to her, and she said, "Who's this guy?" And I tried to describe him, and she said, "Oh, he's a pundit." And I wasn't sure whether this is meant as a compliment or as a criticism. So I said, "Is that a compliment or a criticism?" And she said, "Oh no, it's a compliment. It's really good to have pundits around." So if you want to put something on your CV, it's a pundit who's good to have around. Okay.
Okay, good.
But anyway, so it's
that climate change doesn't just look like bad weather. It also looks like religious warfare, banditry, counterinsurgency, border militarization, and that the connection between, the causal connection between climate change and various forms of violence may be attenuated, but it is very real and can be fleshed out. A couple days ago, there was a report released from Colombia that showed a correlation between El Nino events and violence. And the report didn't really explain what that, the paper guessed at what some of the causes could be. But of course, what the connections between violence and climate change run through all of the human institutions that are essentially what you would call imperialism, or more specifically, capitalism operating on a global scale. More specifically, what's happening now throughout the Global South is what I call the catastrophic convergence, which is a convergence of two pre-existing crises with the onset of anthropogenic climate change. And those pre-existing crises are the legacy of Cold War militarism, which has